Peace, family. Y'all know who it is. Bakari Lumumba, the progenitor of LumumbaSpeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe we could gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black. Back once again with another video. Before we get started, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and hit the notification bell. So we're back with our third installment of our groundbreaking series, Combating the Carceral State. And so for many of you who may be unaware, the carceral state is idealized as the idea and the concept in which all social problems are rooted in what incarcerating individuals. And of course, we don't believe that. But just to give a brief overview, part one, we looked at historical issue, contemporary problem, where we really leaned on and borrowed from our warrior sister, our warrior scholar, Michelle Alexander's seminal book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness, where we looked at the fact that Black people, unfortunately, since the advent of chattel enslavement here in America, have been under a system of social control. And one of the things that she argues is that racism is highly adaptable. So we went from chattel enslavement to sharecropping to convict leasing to Black codes. And then, of course, from Black codes, we had Jim Crow and now the New Jim Crow. And she describes the New Jim Crow as a manner in which anyone who has the label, the designation of being a convicted felon can now be legally discriminated against in the same manner, mind you, in the same manner that African Americans were legally discriminated against during the Jim Crow era, right? So we're talking about the new Jim Crow. What we're stating is that anyone who is a legally convicted felon is now able to be legally discriminated against in the same manner that African Americans were discriminated against during the Jim Crow era. Part two, we looked at what? Looking at the history of criminality in America. And for many, they were surprised to find that the face historically of criminality in America all the way up until we could say the 1950s was white people, particularly white men, right? So when we look at individuals such as Pretty Boy Floyd, Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, Al Capone, Babyface Nelson, etc., the list goes on, as they say, right? That the face of criminality, not only high crime, but even street level crime, right? We could talk about the St. Valentine's Day slaughter in Chicago, on the north side of Chicago, right? The 5 Points neighborhoods in Manhattan that was dramatized in the movie Gangs in New York. That the face of criminality in America, historically, had always been white people, particularly white men. But what happened, unfortunately, after the Civil Rights Black Power movement, where Black people were asserting and standing up for their rights and fighting for not only their constitutional rights or inalienable rights, but their human rights, right? Their right to be treated as a human being with dignity and respect, as Malcolm X so eloquently stated many decades ago. That the face of criminality turned to Black people. And of course, we know this in part came as a result of the Nixon administration's push of law and order, to where anyone who was looking to engage in civil disobedience was seen as a criminal, as a miscreant, and that the best way to solve a social problem was to lock them up and throw away the key. And of course, in the 1980s, we had the crack cocaine epidemic. We all know all about Reagan, the CIA, and the Contras, right? And then, of course, last but not least, then we had the 90s, where we had this high wave of crime, right? That brought in the crime bill, right? 3 strikes and you're out, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, here we are today in 2022. So part 3, we're looking at how can we actually defeat the carceral state, right? Many people are able to articulate and elucidate and intellectually masturbate on what the problem is and how long it's been taking place, and this perspective and this theoretical perspective. But many people don't look at how do you actually solve this problem, right? We know at one point, it was 1 in 6 Black men would be on prison, probation, or parole. Then it became 1 in 5. Then it became 1 in 4, and now many are saying it's 1 in 3, right? And so when it becomes 1 in 3, I think that this means that the issue is systemic, right? It's different when it's 1 in 6 or 1 in 12. You can say, okay, Little Willie, Daryl, Pookie, and Ray Ray, they're just not into the right things. But it becomes 1 in 3, we know that there's an issue, and we know that unfortunately the fastest growing incarceration rate for any racial or gender group, is black women. And of course, there's a lot of discussions about why that is, right? From a feminist perspective, from a social structural interactionist perspective, and from a conflict perspective. But we're going to focus on what can we do, right? And I think first and foremost, we have to understand that we cannot, under any circumstances, authorize, support, or condone criminal activity in our communities. And many people say, what are you talking about? As I stated in part 2, there's a great book entitled, Lord have mercy, I misplaced the book. There's a great book by Professor Keisha Blaine. She's a PhD, a professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. And the book is entitled Set the World on Fire: Black Women and the Global Freedom Struggle, right? And she talks about that the community ethos in the black community in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and even the 50s was that if you went to jail, you were bringing shame upon your family, but also that being a criminal was acting white, right? Nowadays, unfortunately, 70 years later, we tend to unfortunately believe, with the slave mind, as Malcolm would say, that being smart, being articulate, being educated, having a plan in life is acting white. We don't believe in that type of foolishness anymore. We're waking up and we're understanding that being educated and being an intellectual and being astute is actually being our true African selves. But I say that to say that unfortunately there was a time in which fortunately there was a time in which we believed that being a criminal was acting white due to their history of what? Not only racism and of course slavery, but the genocidal conflicts with Native Americans in the Philippines, so on and so forth, that we said, okay, the face of crime and criminality, of course, is white people, and we don't want to be like them. Or as Malcolm would always say, who are white people to be equal with? We're better than them because we've never killed out whole groups of people. We've never enslaved entire groups of people. We've never colonized entire groups of people, right? And so we're not ascribing or aiming to be equal with the white man and his wife. We're seeking to be better. Right. But I also think we have to understand that when we do condone crime in our community, it creates a domino effect. Right. And so that domino effect is very simple. As we all understand, in the 50s and 60s, when we were fighting for that courageous push to desegregate the schools with Brown v. Board of Education, there was a thing called white flight, in which white people said, I'm not having my children go to school with these Negroes, right? And so as a result, they moved to suburban communities or created private schools, right? And so then we had white flight, but then we had middle class flight in the 1980s and 90s when crime became a huge issue. As many of you can recall, people were being killed for their starter jackets. My brother had a starter jacket, and I can recall in the 90s, my dad actually took the starter jacket and threw it away without my brother's knowledge because he was afraid that he would be robbed on his way walking to school. People were killed for their Jordans, right? People were killed for their Barclays, right? I even have a pair of Barclays now, right? And so I even remember the rapper The Game talking about one of his friends being killed for his Barclay gym shoes, right? And so this was an issue as well. So that leads to middle class flight, where black people of means leave the community because they don't want to live in a crime-infested community. And I don't think anyone truly wants to live in a crime-infested community. But not only does middle class flight happen, you also have something that's known as a broken windows theory, right? And broken windows theory is a sociological term that talks about the fact that when you have low-level, street-level crime in a community, it would then potentially lead to high-level crime. So the analogy they use is that if you have a broken window in a house, and no one fixes it, that will lead to what? Other forms of seemingly innocuous crime like littering. And then littering will lead to what? Street level crime, such as people selling drugs. And then that will lead to what? Property values going down, right? And so you see there's a domino effect. And when property values go down, then what takes place? You have what? Business flight, where businesses will leave the community, right? And then as a result, what do you have? You then have a lower tax base in which our children have to go to what? Underfunded, under-resourced schools. So the domino effect comes along wholeheartedly. So I think it's very important that we understand that regardless of the level of racism, employment discrimination that we face, and we do know that statistics show that black men face employment discrimination more than any other racial gender group in the country. But we can't look to crime as a way to solve our economic problems, because the reality of the situation is we're falling for the banana in the tailpipe because we're engaging in a system that was designed to keep us in a position where we aren't made to survive. Secondly, I think when we talk about combating the carceral state, defeating the carceral state, right, we have to understand that we have to change the leadership model in the black community, right? And you can even say we need to change the leadership model globally, right? typically the leadership model that we have is crisis oriented. We are very reactive. We show up after the fact. We put on our Sunday's best and we bloviate and resort to histrionics. And we talk about all these ways in which Black people's lives are adversely affected in all areas of human activity. That sounds good. It creates great talking points. You might even get on the cover of the front page of your local newspaper. But that doesn't actually solve the problem, right? The best leadership model, I believe, comes from, of course, something that being a military veteran, something in the military, and that is the best maintenance is preventative maintenance. So what do I mean by that? We have to take a preventative maintenance type of perspective when we talk about combating the carceral state. I unfortunately have been incarcerated. I've been arrested before, right? And I volunteered in the county jails. And one of the things that we noticed, the majority of the inmates do not have an education. The majority of inmates read and write at a very low level. So we have to push formal and informal education from a very early age, not just in terms of, oh, you get these credentials so you could go get a job, because the reality situation is we really want to promote entrepreneurship, business owners, etc., but we have to show people that having credentials gives you options in life, that you don't have to go get a pack. You don't have to be a stick-up kid, right? You don't have to hit a lick to make a living, right? You're always looking over your shoulder, hoping that Johnny Law doesn't come and catch you, right? And then number two, we also have to work with our youth to make sure that they have a plan in life, a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C. I can recall when I used to work at the Wright State University in the Veteran Affairs office, and there was a young lady who was an Air Force veteran, and she did 4 years in the Air Force, and she came home and attended Wright State, and she was going to college, and I had a conversation with her, and she said, well, my parents sat down with me my sophomore year in high school, and we formulated a plan. The plan was that I would graduate top 10 of my class, I would go into the Air Force, I would have a particular job specialty, and then I would get out with an honorable discharge, go to college, get a bachelor's degree, and then go to law school. So they actually had a plan in place, right? And so we have to have plans with our children, and well, many people would argue, and those generational curses of just throwing them out the house at 18 and saying, fend for yourself, sink or swim, right? You got to leave the nest and I hope you can fly, right? I think we should be a bit more evolved than that, right? And so I think that is something that is very important when it comes to efficaciously combating the carceral state, that we invest in formal and informal education, make sure we have a plan for our children, but more importantly, hey, make sure that we're doing some Saturday schools as well, some informal education, right? So we're talking about the Jumamosi shoelace, right? And last but not least, I think it's also important to understand that when we talk about it was 1 in 6, then it became 1 in 5. Then it became 1 in 4, and now it's 1 in 3 Black men are on prison, probation, or parole. And of course, Black women are the fastest growing racial gender group in the penal system. I think it's very important that we have a conversation with people that, hey, it may be likely that at some point in your life, you're going to end up in the back of a squad car, that you're going to be accused of a crime. I myself, speaking from experience, have been accused of a crime that I was 100% did not commit. And I think it's very important, and I'm going to actually be evoking the wisdom of Dr. Huey P. Newton, who was a co-founder of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And I'm going to put some respect on Huey P. Newton's name by making sure I refer to him as Dr. Huey P. Newton, because most people do not acknowledge that he had a PhD in social science. And so one of the things he taught us in his memoir, Revolutionary Suicide, is that the reality of the situation is, if you've been placed on arrest, he said, don't resist. This makes you look as combative. It makes you come off as uncooperative, and it makes you come off as someone who is unwilling to yield to legal authority, right? He said the other issue is you would get another charge and your bond would be higher. He says they tell you you're under arrest. You simply say, okay, get booked, and hopefully your bond isn't so much so that you could go straight to the jail, call your family, and bond out. He said the second issue is don't have a conversation with the police. He says the police job in all situations is to make you get you to say something that puts you in a bad light, makes you look like a liar, or somehow keys you to the crime that you've been alleged of committing. So I think it's very important that he would state you only have one conversation, and that's with your attorney, and you tell your story one time and one time only, and that's on the witness stand, right? So if you do come in contact with police, you have to understand that being arrested is not a conviction, right? I've been arrested before, unfortunately, but I was not convicted of the crime I was arrested for. One, because I was innocent, but two, I knew my rights, right? We know that 95% of all criminal cases end in a plea deal. We know that black people, unfortunately, are what? Overcharged and over what? Sentenced. And so I think it's very important, as in my case, when I was arrested, I knew I was 100% innocent. I go to court for my trial, and there was a situation in which they offered me a plea deal. Hey, you could plead down to this, no jail time. Absolutely not, right? I took it to trial, and of course, I was acquitted by a jury of my peers, right? But I think it's very important that we understand how to efficaciously combat the carceral state. There have been several conversations about this issue, right? Like I said, Michelle Alexander even wrote a great book about this, but she argued that there had to be a social movement. And I don't think there's really going to be a social movement. As we know, the criminal justice system is a industry, right? It's really a criminal justice business, not a system. And it is a multi-billion-dollar business, right? And so we have to look at some things that we can do individually to combat the carceral state. And I believe I've listed these things that, one, we have to understand that we can't accept crime in our community of any kind because it creates a domino effect that negatively affects us more than anyone else. Number two, we have to change the leadership model in our community from being crisis-oriented to focusing on preventative maintenance and the building, development, and maintenance of power, because we have to understand that in this world, it isn't about love, it isn't about feelings, it's not about coming together. We live in a world in which might is right, and that those who have power are the ones who are able to what? Make decisions. And then number three, we have to make sure that with our youth, we sit down with them, that we teach them how to have a plan for life, right? I think that is the utmost importance. And then understanding that because we live in a carceral state, because we live in a police state, because we're living in a society in which there are Gestapo tactics by the police against black people, we have to understand that if you are arrested, don't resist. Right? Not resisting doesn't mean that you're conceding that you're guilty, right? But we don't want you in a situation where you're getting more charges tacked on, that when you go to trial, they can say, well, look how combative he was, and that goes against your ability to be believed by the jury, right? Your credibility is shot. And so understanding that, go to jail, call your family, get the bond posted. If you can't post the bond, then you have to be mentally strong enough to say, hey, I'm going to fight this out on the inside, and make sure that the only time you tell your story is on the witness stand and to your attorney. Any conversation you have with a police officer, they're trying to get you to talk so that they can put you in a bad light, and oftentimes get you to say something that would make you seem as if you're guilty. So that's what we have now. This was a bit of a long video, but this was part 3 on combating the carceral state. We're talking about defeating the carceral state, right? And so once again, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button, hit the notification bell. Until next time, peace. Before you go, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. Thank you for supporting the channel. And remember, here at Lumumba Speaks, we always bet on black. Peace.